It's very easy.
Green button going.
A lot of deals are being made outside, so
What's that?
I said a lot of deals are being made outside.
Yeah. So how does the clicker work?
Okay, let me get everybody from back out. Speaker. The way I have it, I'm sorry. We have Michael going first. Then we're happy, once you lift them. People go inside, it's hard to get it back. Yeah, which is a great thing. I told him to and follow. I tried. I told you how many that came in. Yeah. I'm giving 2 more minutes. We start and then they start coming in. 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. You're gonna have a demo, right? I want everybody to see it. Okay, fine. Oh, you haven't tested it? Oh, yeah. Oh, okay. Everything. Oh, cool. All right, well, welcome back. We're gonna start our next session. We're gonna be launching into the first of two sessions. The first one is gonna be focusing on food waste. Food represents nearly 1/4 of all municipal solid waste that end up in landfill. As communities look for sustainable solutions to manage food waste and divert organics from landfills, our panelists this morning will make sure that communities would consider routing waste through our wastewater system instead, where they can recover valuable resources like clean energy and nutrients from it. This morning, we will be hearing from Michael Keelan, Manager of Environmental Engineering for InSinkErator, from Kevin Schaefer, Executive Director of Milwaukee Metropolitan Sewage District, and Scott Pasternak, Senior Project Manager and Associate with Burns and McDonnell. If I understand correctly, we'll be going in that order. So we'll start with Michael.
Thanks, Alex. Good morning, everyone. Thanks for coming. And thanks to Juby for organizing this event. It's a pleasure of mine to come here and speak to everybody in the garbage business. And I brought the humble garbage disposal with me. So hopefully we have enough time. I'm going to be able to do a little bit of a demonstration when I'm done. So the EPA evaluated how much food waste we generated. Their last report came out in 2018. It totaled 63 million tons per year. About 40% of that comes from the residential sector. You may have heard of Jonathan Bloom. He wrote a book a few years ago about food waste, and he said, for local context, we could fill up the Rose Bowl every day with the food waste that we generate here in the US. Quite a bit of food waste. Now that 40% of residential food waste equates to just under 8 pounds per household per week. So over the last decade or so, states like California, where we are today, have passed mandates to keep food waste out of landfills. There's actually 9 states that have done this. And I'm reading a book by Benjamin Barber. It's called If Mayors Ruled the World. And he said, put it very matter-of-factly, it's nations that are setting these goals, it's states that are passing the mandates like the food waste diversion mandates, but it's the cities that get things done. And it's folks like you that work for the cities that are helping to accomplish that. So the reason I'm here today is to bring something to your attention that you may not have thought about. We want you folks to be including disposers or garbage disposals, like the one over here, in your discussions. Because as you're going to see here in just a few minutes, the disposer is managing about 30% of the food waste in a home that has a disposer. So over the last several years, I've come to this description of how the disposer is at the intersection of 3 environmental megatrends: food waste loss and reduction. And certainly if I forget to mention it, we don't want to waste food. The disposer is for unavoidable food waste, not for avoidable. You've got a goal that's been set by the US Department of Agriculture and the US EPA to reduce our food waste by 50% by the year 2030. Then you've got this concept I mentioned a minute ago, landfill diversion of organics, 9 states, including cities like San Francisco, Portland, Austin, that have zero waste plans. And as Alex said, with 25% of our garbage being food waste, if you're going to go after a zero waste plan, you're probably needing to include food waste as a part of that. And then the last mega trend that's most dear to my heart, because I spent nearly 20 years in the wastewater industry before I came to InSinkErator, is the concept of resource recovery. I learned very early on in my career that the wastewater treatment plant used to be called the sanitation plant or the sewage treatment plant. And then in the 70s, with the passage of the Clean Water Act, we began calling them the water pollution control facility. And then the water reclamation plant more recently, where we're reclaiming that water. Well, now they're rebranding themselves as the water resource recovery facility. And that's because they make clean water, energy, and fertilizer. And if you think about it, food waste is mostly water. So you're going to reclaim that water. You're going to make energy through anaerobic digestion at the treatment plant. And you're going to make fertilizer with the biosolids. So the disposer is truly at the intersection of these trends. And if you look at it from a sustainability perspective, instead of just using a disposer for convenience and hygiene, which has been done for over 80 years, think about the environmental impacts. A disposer always results in lower global warming potential than landfilling. There are the additional benefits of producing energy and reducing nutrients at the treatment plant. From a social point of view, if you've had a disposer, you always want one. It helps you to keep your kitchen clean and eliminates odors. So they're very socially acceptable. That's why 60% of the homes in the US have one. And then from an economic perspective, it's actually the least expensive option for managing food waste from the municipal perspective. And that's because the homeowner or the consumer pays for the appliance, both its installation and its use. My role over the last 15 years has been to help InSinkErator become subject matter experts in food waste. I interact with groups like this to learn what you perceive as knowledge gaps, and then to perhaps fill those knowledge gaps if they haven't already been filled. We engage with academia and other trade professionals to commission research like the Water Environment Research Foundation that we did in 2012. And we're involved in the codes as well to make sure that these devices are being designed and used properly. We did a comprehensive life cycle assessment to look at all the environmental impacts of different food waste management pathways, and I'll share a little bit about that in a minute. And we've also done research on fats, oils, and greases that Casey can share more if you have time in our networking session. And then we're very transparent about this research. We make it publicly available through our website, both the research that we do as well as third parties. We want municipalities to begin to look at the disposer as a part of the solution to managing food waste. How do we normally manage our food waste? Well, you can take it to an incinerator, you can put it in a landfill. That's where most of our food waste goes in the US. You can do centralized composting. It's growing very much so here in California as cities are spending millions of dollars to initiate green bin programs. You can compost it in your backyard as well. And then this concept of wastewater treatment. Now, the first 3 methods all involve a truck. And we've heard a lot about trucks today. But of course, the disposer uses the sewers instead of a truck. And think about sending the food waste through the sewers and it reaching the treatment plant in just a few hours, as opposed to getting to the landfill and the landfill cell being covered perhaps 2 or 3 years later. Now, most of you are from municipalities, so I assume you visited your local wastewater treatment plant. But if not, I've provided a kind of a basic diagram of a conventional activated sludge treatment plant. And you can see a logo that we developed about 5 years ago that we put on the boxes of our disposers. When you send the food waste through your disposer, it sends it to a treatment plant, and then it can be collected as the residuals, the biosolids, and then land applied on crops to create more food. The one thing I would point out in the diagram is that sometimes there's the conception that if you send food waste to a treatment plant, it's going to be filtered out in the bar racks and then landfilled anyway. Disposers grind food waste into particles that are 2 to 3 millimeters in size. They're going to go through those bar screens and into this primary clarifiers, settle out and go to the digesters. And then the soluble carbon can go through to the secondary part of the treatment plant. And that's used by the bugs, the microorganisms, to help take out nitrogen and phosphorus before the water is discharged to our waterways. And then the residuals that are digested, if it's done so with anaerobic digestion in the absence of oxygen, excuse me, you create methane. And that methane can be used in a cogeneration set to create electricity and heat. Excuse me. Now, real briefly, I'll just point out some of the trends today in the wastewater industry. I'm doing my best to try and remember, call the wastewater treatment plant the water resource recovery facility. It's this clean water, energy, and fertilizer concept. About half of all of the residuals produced in the US at the treatment plants are beneficially reused on agriculture. And are you familiar with the product Milorganite? Anybody here? I know Kevin is. So Milorganite's been made by the Milwaukee Metropolitan Sewage District for over 90 years. You can find it at your local home store and you can use it on your lawn as fertilizer. And it's the biosolids from the treatment plant. The picture there is the Jones Island facility where they actually kiln dry the pellets. I mentioned anaerobic digestion. Unfortunately, not every treatment plant has anaerobic digestion to process their biosolids. But even though it's only about 10% of the facilities, they are treating over about 50% of all flows. And in places like California, 90% of the wastewater is treated at facilities with anaerobic digestion. And you've got facilities like East Bay Municipal Utility District that have been making their own energy by bringing food waste from outside sources and putting it into the digesters. At one point, they were creating more than 200% of their energy demand by bringing in food waste. So that's not going through the sewers, that's being trucked in and put directly into the digesters. So about 10 or 12 years ago, we began a partnership with MMSD, and that's why I brought Kevin Schaefer here today. They've got a graphic on their website that says, don't be the cat putting the food scraps in the garbage, send it down through your garbage disposal so they can help make more energy and make more Milorganite. So real briefly on a little bit of science, I mentioned our life cycle assessment. Using a disposer in conjunction with one of 8 types of wastewater treatment plants always results in lower global warming potential. And in fact, it's 50% better for even the most energy intensive extended aeration plants, 90% better if your plant has anaerobic digestion. And if that anaerobic digestion is also doing combined heat and power, it's net negative carbon, such as the case with MMSD. From an economic perspective, we worked with the Water Environment Research Foundation to do the sustainable food waste evaluation. And using a disposer in conjunction with a treatment plant is the least expensive option of all 5. The most often mentioned concern I get from folks in the wastewater industry is, well, you shouldn't send your food waste through the sewers. It's going to clog up our sewers. Certainly the concept is it's solid. Well, actually food waste is 75 to 90% water. And there's been dozens of studies all around the world that discount this theory that somehow it's going to plug up your sewers. And there's one study out of the University of Sheffield that was a 5-year PhD study that just became available here recently. And then lastly, from an energy and nutrient removal perspective, we worked with George Chavanaclaus, who was one of the authors of the wastewater engineering textbook. And he proved that using food waste and disposers going to the treatment plant always results in a net energy gain if you've got anaerobic digestion, and it helps the nutrient removal process. We followed that up by working with George Nakla at Western University in London, Ontario, and it was published in the Journal of Environmental Management in 2019. He did 142 different scenarios and proved that indeed you do create more energy by using a disposer, and you can reduce the nutrients, and it actually reduces overall treatment costs because of those two things. Here's the Sheffield study. There's been multiple papers that have been published, but this one in particular looks at the characteristics and in-sewer transport of solids derived from food waste disposers. It was published just last year. They looked at particle size distribution, settling velocities in the sewers. They did some video camera work. The bottom line is that there were negligible impacts to those sewers from disposers. The only particles that did briefly settle out were eggshells, and they are animated, if you will, and put back into the flow when flow increases back through the sewer. I mentioned the textbook. I actually attended the conference where George Shabana shared the results of his research and then led to this quote that's in the textbook. The challenge in the future is how to extract energy from wastewater most efficiently. We should be encouraging the use of kitchen grinders. So that's in the latest edition. As with any research, you want to look at all the costs, the benefits. And almost always when there's an environmental solution being presented, there's trade-offs, right? So if you look at the red arrow pointing down, there are some slight operational cost increase, a few extra biosolids. You might have a little bit higher electrical cost for aeration. But at the end of the day, because of the methane being used for energy in the anaerobic digesters and the supplemental carbon that offsets the need for methanol, for example, to reduce nitrogen and phosphorus in the treatment plant's effluent, you have a net lower cost of wastewater treatment by sending the food waste through a disposer to a treatment plant. So we did a study in 5 different cities, including Milwaukee, Philadelphia, Tacoma, Boston, and then eventually Chicago. And what we wanted to do was find out what the effective use of a disposer was. Because if you think about it, once you put the food waste down the disposer, it disappears. You just don't know how much is being processed. So we found a neighborhood in each one of these cities where they had no disposers, and we installed somewhere between 70 and 90 disposers in each of these neighborhoods. We measured how much food waste was in the garbage before they had a disposer, waited a year later, and went back and did a follow-up waste characterization. And very consistently, all 5 cities, or at least 4 out of the 5, determined that there was 30% reduction of food waste in the garbage. We had inconclusive results in Chicago. We worked with local community groups to do the education and outreach. And this 30% ended up being very important because we took it to the EPA. Here's just further detail on those 5 cities we worked at to determine the effective use of disposer. You can see we did 173 households in Philadelphia. And eventually, after this study, they passed a law where you have to install disposers in all new construction. The results were very consistent from a percentage point of view, but it's about 1 to 4 pounds per household per week were being processed in the disposer. The EPA has their food waste or food recovery hierarchy. And as I said earlier, it's always best to reduce it at the source or feed hungry people or feed animals. But at the end of the day, there's always going to be unavoidable food waste. Think of your fruits and vegetable peelings. So my mantra is reduce the avoidable, but responsibly manage the unavoidable. The 4th layer down in the hierarchy is the industrial uses. Unfortunately, almost 60% of our food waste still goes to a landfill. The disposer is in that 4th layer, industrial uses, and the EPA told us when we met with them in 2016, disposers are already implicitly included. If your city has anaerobic digestion at their wastewater treatment plant, it's a good option. This led them to include disposers in the 2018 report. I've got a pretty complicated sand key diagram that shows about 40% of the food waste comes from the residential sector, and then 6% is eventually going through the sewers through disposers. and then the brown layer is what's being landfilled. But this was a culmination of all of our work, the LCA, the WRF study, as well as our 5-study evaluation and the publishing of those results, and then presenting those to the EPA. So there's a quick summary. I've touched on base on all these, but what I want to do is a quick demo. The most important thing with a disposer, because either you, your neighbor, your relative, your partner, or somebody has at some point had a problem, right? They're worried about clogs. We're trying to do a better job as a company. We want you folks to understand the best way to properly use a disposer, and you can virtually grind all your food waste if you do this properly. Turn the water on first, turn the disposer on second, add your food waste slowly, and when it's done grinding, just let the water run for a few seconds. So Casey, you want to give just let the water run a few seconds. You're done. So I'll turn it over to Kevin, and then we'll maybe do some more grinding.
Kevin.
So on the other side of the room, we're going to demonstrate a toilet and you'll get to watch. Good morning, everyone. My name is Kevin Shea from the Executive Director of the Milwaukee Metropolitan Sewage District. And we've been partners with InSinkErator on this effort for a long time. As we go through the discussion, just think about wastewater treatment being, you can have cleaner water at the end, which we discharge into Lake Michigan. Some places put it into rivers and so forth. And then you have biosolids. We used to call it sludge, but we don't call it sludge anymore because that doesn't sound good. So now it's called biosolids. So you have two components that you have separated the waste into. In most places, most utilities will tell you, I don't want more solids in the plant because I have to treat them. I don't want more water because I have to treat that. But at MMSD, we've got a system that has been in place since the early 1920s. And so think about this up until the mid 2000s. And we had a system which has 28 different municipalities, 1.1 million people, 411 square mile area. So this is metropolitan Milwaukee, Wisconsin. We're about an hour and a half north of Chicago, sitting right on Lake Michigan. And our job is to treat wastewater. We also do flood management as well. The key thing is we have 300 miles of pipe that we operate, and our municipalities have about 6,000 miles that they operate. So we have this great collection system from every house, every business, every industry that has a toilet, a pipe system that connects it down to our two water reclamation facilities. I'll show you those in a minute. You've already seen Jones Island. We also have a deep tunnel system, which helps us manage overflows during heavy storms. So you saw a picture of Jones Island from Michael. It's that upper little pin that's in the map there, and the lower pin is the South Shore Water Reclamation Facility. So Jones Island's been operating since 1926. South Shore has been operating since 1965. And it's the basic treatment that goes through almost every treatment plant in the country. Some of them have an extra step called tertiary, which allows you to reuse the water. We don't do that. But preliminary, primary, secondary disinfection, discharge to the lake. So in 2009, I wrote a vision that said, on the left side of the brain, I want to be have an integrated watershed management approach, zero overflow, zero homes in the 100-year floodplain. We're working on that. We're pretty close actually on that. On the right side of the brain, it's the climate adaptation mitigation steps and trying to become more renewable with our energy. So we want to be 100% renewable with energy, 80% of that being self-produced. And then we have other efforts to reduce our carbon footprint and to sequester more carbon. But that 80% self-produced is where the food waste from the residential customers comes into play. Milorganite, Milwaukee Organic Nitrogen, been producing it since 1926. I saw some people raise your hand. Thank you. Keep buying it. That offsets our rates about $10 to $11 million a year so that we can save our ratepayers that amount. So when you go back to the theory of biosolids, clean water, we like biosolids because we can produce more Milorganite. We can sell more Milorganite. We can offset our rates. We're actually, since the pandemic started in 2020, we're producing less than we're selling. So people are buying it up, I think, because they're at home more now. So we're selling more Milorganite than we can make. So the more we can get, the better we are. So again, before we even talk about food waste, we have 2 wastewater treatment plants. They're about 12 miles apart. And at South Shore, we have digesters where we can digest the sludge, the biosolids that come into the system. We take that digested material and we pump it 12 miles to Jones Island, where it gets mixed into the digested sludge at Jones Island, and that's where we make Milorganite. We have the anaerobic digesters at South Shore, which we produce methane gas as well. So at South Shore, we're getting energy through methane gas, and then we're taking those digested biosolids and sending them to Jones Island for Milorganite. So it's very sustainable. And up until now, it's the same system that's been in place for 80, 90 years. The gas that we get through the digestion is about 60% of natural gas. So it's not natural gas, but it's pretty close. And it's burned in engine generators to produce electricity. As I said, we take the biosolids, we take those to Jones Island, we make Milorganite out of that. And about 98% of all of our biosolids are produced into Milorganite. Sometimes we have to farm apply. We've not had to do that for a while. At the Jones Island facility, again, 64 they were constructed, operation 65, 8 digesters, different capacity. They're huge. They're huge underground tanks. And they take about 600,000 gallons of biosolids a day, just from human waste, not any food waste yet. There's probably some in there, but yeah. Here's the digesters. We collect the gas off of those digesters and store them in these cylinders. And then we use that in these engine generators to produce electricity at our South Shore plant. Here's just some pictures of some of the generators. And then on the occasion where we can't use all the gas they're producing, we have our own flare that we then flare the extra biogas from. So that's really the system that was in place pretty much up until the mid-2000s. And we thought, wow, what an opportunity. And Syncerator approached us and we said, what an opportunity. We could do more with what we already have built. So we did a study with Marquette University on co-digestion in 2008, had food waste mixed with the biosolids, measured gas production. We thought we'd see about a 5 to 12% increase in production, in gas production, and negligible or very small increases in sludge production that we saw. We saw an increase in the overall BTU produced and no decline in the gas quality that we'd already been producing. So we increased our self-produced energy. This goes along with the vision that we set in 2009, 2010, completed construction of an offloading facility. So if you have grocery stores, restaurants, places that want to send their food waste to you, you need to have a place to receive it. And then we installed new mixing units in our digesters between 2016 and 2019. So these digesters have been in place since 1964, 65. And we were only getting a certain amount of gas from them because we hadn't improved the mixing units. So we put new mixers into the digesters. Here's one of them. And you can see the size of these with the staff guy standing there. So you improve the mixing units so it could produce more methane gas from the same amount of biosolids that we had before. Here's the offloading facility we built. So trucks come in here, offload their material. Another picture. We call it high strength waste in wastewater world. So in 2016, we started working with InSinkErator more vigorously with the grind to energy program. And from 16 to 17, we're averaging about 350,000 gallons per year of material that we would receive. The pandemic hit and that slowed deliveries down significantly. Picked up again in mid-August. We had a local digester that closed that was taking a different type of material. And that started to come to us then. And in 2021, the total was around that 350,000 gallons again, and averaging about 80,000 gallons per month. So far to date, and this I think is end of September numbers, we're at 624,000 gallons, averaging about 70,000 gallons per month that we're receiving. This is all coming through grocery stores, and we take about 6 to 8 trucks per week this year going to that offloading facility that I showed you. Well, here's the bang for the buck. About 0.6% of our total digester feedstock is from high strength waste. So it's not a lot of feedstock that we're taking above and beyond what we were already taking before. But it's producing about 9% of our total biogas production. So we're getting more energy from that 0.6% that we can use in our generators to produce electricity to lessen our cost for energy. And approximately 40 to 60 million cubic feet of digester gas is derived from this high strength waste in 2021. And we're estimating that saves us between $130,000 to $260,000 per year. So back to the sustainability, it's environmentally friendly, sustainable, saves people money. It's been a win-win for us so far. You have to make sure that your wastewater treatment plant has digesters and then they're willing to handle the additional biosolids that come from this, but that's a very small amount, as you can see. Again, I won't just show the toilet, but thank you. This is a great picture of our wastewater plant looking at downtown Milwaukee, which is right next door. So thank you. Yeah.
Hi, good morning. I'm Scott Pasternak with Burns and McDonnell, and so much of the work that myself, Bob Craigs, who's here from Burns and Mac, and others do, is to work with our local governmental clients to help them figure out really important issues from a solid waste and materials management perspective. And we've seen just a very significant uptick in their interest in food waste. And these are really cities across the country, especially in the kind of the middle part of the United States. So you've got cities like Fargo, North Dakota, Springfield, Missouri, a couple of communities in the Dallas-Fort Worth area that I'll talk about today that are all very interested in this topic. And so it's I know we just heard from Kevin talking about what's going on in Milwaukee as another example in the central part of the United States. So not all of this is just happening, say, on the West Coast. And so as we were preparing for today's session, after hearing what these guys were going to talk about and really appreciating their perspectives, I thought I would focus my discussion on, for you all sitting here today as solid waste directors or senior level managers, what do you really need to know about food waste? I know for me over the last several years, it's been a really eye-opening experience as far as what the potential opportunities are that are out there. So I'll touch on some of what Michael talked about as far as why food waste is so important to talk about. And then maybe to go a little bit of a different perspective to what Kevin was talking about, to give a sense of, well, what does it mean when you really talk about taking food, sending it to anaerobic digesters? I think he covered that really well, but I want to add another element, and that is, what about utilizing gas from those efforts to fuel your vehicles, whether it's a part of your solid waste and recycling fleet or other trucks within your community? And then I want to close with a discussion about hopefully being a little bit of a mind reader for you all as solid waste directors in terms of thinking about what are some of the questions that you may be considering as you start to think about this topic. So in terms of why food waste, again, Michael covered this pretty effectively. This is a pie chart that is the same data that he communicated, which shows that food waste does represent more than 20% of the material that is going to landfill. It also is a very carbon intensive portion of what is there in the waste stream. So the more that we can do to effectively minimize, even if you have a landfill gas collection system, to the extent that you can minimize food waste going to landfill, it's going to provide a very significant positive benefit from a carbon perspective. Michael also communicated and identified that there's at least 9 states that have regulatory requirements in place related to food waste. And then from a corporation perspective, we are seeing a huge increase in interest from a environmental, social, and governance perspective. This is a key part of what I discussed with this group at my presentation last year. But effectively, you're going to see more and more companies, for example, the grocery stores that Kevin referred to, that are going to be looking for ways in which they can divert this type of material. So I think it's really important as cities for you all to really start thinking about, if you haven't already, what are going to be some of the strategies that you put in place to address this. So what about food waste to anaerobic digestion, then to fuel? So this is a concept that you may not be super familiar with. So let me just walk through with you what we're really getting at here. So again, another slide that was communicated a few minutes ago in terms of the food recovery hierarchy. And so as was discussed, where anaerobic digestion fits in is just right above composting. And so the way that we look at this is that from a hierarchy perspective, if you can actually generate energy from the management of food waste, that is actually preferred over composting. This slide also communicates that we're not advocating at all for only one approach or the other, but going forward, we expect to see a combination of efforts focused on the continuation of composting, but then also anaerobic digestion potentially having a more prevalent role when it comes to the management of food waste. You all may also be asking yourself, well, what is all this going to cost? And so much of that really depends from an anaerobic digestion perspective. If you have to go out and build a brand new facility, that's going to be much more expensive than, as Kevin talked about, where you're just able to make some capital or operational improvements to your processing system. This slide is actually another graphic representation of what some of Michael communicated, but gives you a sense of when we talk about taking food waste, sending it to anaerobic digestion, and then making renewable natural gas, how does that work? So it starts from left to right, where you have to have your feedstock, so that can be food waste. If you're in an area where there's significant agriculture, manure is a great source of that material as well. And then the material has to be collected, whether that's through an incinerator type system, or as was mentioned earlier, through some type of collection system involving vehicles. Then that material at some point needs to be chopped up via some type of a macerator, whether it's a disposal, or it could also be a bigger macerator, either at the site of, say, a hotel here like the Marriott, or it could be a macerator that is on site at the wastewater treatment plant. But at some point, that material does have to be processed into a slurry. And from there, it can go into the anaerobic digestion system. So there's a number of steps that occur during that process. But ultimately, you can then have a gas that can then be utilized either for electricity. You can put it for use directly at a site to generate heat. Or what I want to talk about today is what about the idea of taking that gas and making renewable natural gas to fuel vehicles. So who is doing this around the country? Here's just a couple of examples. This is actually a slide from Energy Vision, which is a group that we've worked with on a few projects as they work with communities to help figure out opportunities to make this into a reality. And a couple of projects that they've talked to us about is one is just in Northern California and another one in Grand Junction, Colorado. So in both cases, they are able to send food waste to anaerobic digesters and then be able to utilize that fuel to run, in the case of the San Francisco example, about 10 to 12 private refuse collection vehicles. And for Grand Junction, Colorado, they're able to power about 40 vehicles within their broader municipal fleet. So in terms of, as a solid waste director, what are some key questions you're hopefully starting to think about? So one first question, and I'll go through these in a little bit more depth individually, but from a sector perspective, where do you focus your efforts? Should it be on the residential and or the commercial sector? What about the concept of vehicle fueling? Why should you even be thinking about this? We've heard so much good discussion at the summit about electrification. Where does RNG fit in this? Is there a logical case for RNG? From a wastewater department perspective, should you go and take the director of the wastewater department out for lunch? So that's, in all seriousness, to make this work, it's got to be a collaborative effort on the wastewater side. Rick, you gotta take yourself out to lunch since you have both roles. So from a funding perspective, there's been so much activity lately. I want to touch a little bit about what funding is out there. And don't worry, I've got a great resource that I can refer you to as well for that information. And that's the last point of, hey, Scott, is there a good reference guide out there? And I'll give you a hint, it's a Burns and Mac report. So in terms of the how to service the residential and the commercial sector, over here on the left-hand side represents more or less what you would see in a typical municipal situation in terms of how much food waste is generated in the green from the residential sector and the blue from the ICI, or we'll call it the commercial sector. Again, Michael had this as a part of his slide deck communicating that that's roughly about a 60 commercial, 40 residential split. And part of how this slide is structured, and we've utilized this, the city of Austin will recognize it from some of our planning efforts with you all, but I think it's representative of what a lot of cities face from a overall planning perspective, to where a city will directly collect or contract out for the residential system, but it could be a much more varied approach to how the commercial sector is managed. And so going forward, with respect to the commercial sector, that's where we would expect that you'll have more influence, whereas in the residential side, you have much more direct control. And so that will affect what you can do or can't do from a food waste perspective. So typically on the commercial side, you may manage this via ordinances that would be put in place or various policies. Where on the residential side, you can make your own decisions about how to collect food scraps, whether that's co-collected with green waste or a separate collection. In terms of the types of vehicles on the commercial side, that's most often done with front load and or vacuum trucks, although carts can definitely play a role given the heavy nature of that material type. And on residential, it's definitely a cart-based type system usually, and recommended to be once per week. Typically, though, in terms of a cost effectiveness perspective, you're going to get a better bang for your buck on the commercial side. I mean, just think about the differences and how much material you could get, say, from this Marriott hotel as opposed to running a bunch of routes within your community to collect from individual houses. So this slide gives you a sense of what are we talking about for the various types of trucks. So you all surely are very familiar with commercial front load as well as residential side load. Again, thanks to Austin for having always such nice clean trucks for us to take pictures of. But what I wanted to really point out is for the example that Kevin talked about, where he showed that picture where trucks can offload at the wastewater treatment plant, the way that happens is the material would be collected. This just happens to be an example from InSinkErator's Grind to Energy company, but that material can be collected for a significant period of time in those columns that are at the bottom of the page. And that material gets processed through a macerator before going into that system. And then it gets offloaded into a vacuum or a slurry truck. And then that's what would then get offloaded, say at Kevin's wastewater treatment plant. So as I mentioned a few minutes ago, there's been a lot of great discussion, not only at this summit, but over the last couple of years about electrification of vehicles. And I just wanted to provide some context because I think a lot of times renewable natural gas gets overlooked in that discussion. And I think from a carbon life cycle perspective, RNG actually provides a significant number of positive impacts. So what this slide communicates is what is the life cycle carbon intensity of various petroleum and alternative fuels. So the higher the number, the greater the carbon impact is. So you want to have as low of a number as you can. So from going from left to right, gasoline, diesel, and hydrogen all rank about the same. And then we see CNG and electricity, if it's based off of just the whatever's coming off of the traditional grid here in California, because this is data from the California, from the California Air Resources Control Board. But then you start to see very positive benefits from electrification if you're able to source that from renewable sources like wind and solar. But when you get into renewable natural gas, either from food waste on the left-hand side or from manure on the right-hand side, that's where you actually get to a carbon positive perspective. So one of the reasons for that is if you think about for all of these processes, what's the level of effort associated with the utilization of these fuels? And it's just much less effort and correspondingly a lower carbon impact through the use of renewable natural gas. What are some of the benefits of utilizing RNG? First off is, as I just showed on the preceding slide, you're able to significantly reduce emissions. In the upper right, with what we've been seeing as far as not just the volatility, but the skyrocketing of the cost of other types of fuel sources, if you're able to get a dedicated source of RNG, you kind of have that in a captured type of system. So you're not going to be exposed to the severe volatility and high pricing that we've been experiencing. Also, if you generate more fuel than what you need, then you can sell that to help offset the other costs that you have. And then this also can play a significant role from an environmental justice perspective. I'll talk in a few minutes about the project that we did for the North Central Texas Council of Governments in the Dallas-Fort Worth region. But a part of our scope there included evaluating projects with regard to environmental justice. And what we found was that if you can start to better utilize renewable natural gas because of the reduction in emissions, you can then have a very positive impact in terms of reducing emissions at landfills, which may be located in areas that are sensitive from an environmental justice perspective, as well as operating vehicles that are going to be better for the environment in areas that may be prone to environmental justice issues as well. And then this also provides an opportunity for energy independence. So as I talked about earlier, in terms of the importance of collaboration with your wastewater department, this is actually an overview of the system with the city of Denton. And Adrian and Eugene are here today. So if you want to ask them any questions about their journey on this issue, they would be, I think, more than happy to talk with you about that. Because this was one of the two pilot projects that we looked at for the project that we did for the North Central Texas Council of Governments. But as a solid waste director, when you take the wastewater director out for lunch, you need to talk to them about, hey, do you have any excess capacity within your anaerobic digestion system? On the next slide, I'll talk about the city of Dallas, and they happen to have at one of their wastewater treatment plants significant excess capacity because of prior successful water conservation efforts. It's also really important to start to get an understanding of what type of capital and operational improvements are going to be needed. As Kevin showed, that facility was never originally designed to be able to take in those trucks. And so they did incur costs in building the capability to take in that additional material. And then does your city already have some type of a biogas to energy system in place, either as a part of the wastewater treatment plant, or it could be on the landfill side? And then how can you collaborate together to recognize, yes, there are going to be additional expenses, but then there may be additional revenue as well to create a win-win partnership. So with the city of Dallas, here we looked at, again, because they have significant excess capacity, sending food waste to their Southside wastewater treatment plant. The city of Dallas McComas Bluff landfill is located just a few miles away from that facility and at the landfill, they already have an existing biogas to energy facility that's already making renewable natural gas. So the idea here would be to send that gas from the wastewater treatment plant to the facility that's already at the landfill. That could be done either via pipeline, or you can compress the gas and truck it over there. And then all of these blue dots are various trucking facilities in the immediate vicinity that are really just prime customers for the use of this RNG, including City of Dallas vehicles as well. So in terms of funding sources, there's lots out there on the funding side. Yesterday, somebody talked about an example of getting dollars from the Volkswagen Clean Air Act, but there's a bunch of other ones on the reference guide that I'll show you all in a few minutes. We actually have a part of that report that talks about all of these funding sources in great detail. But I did want to briefly highlight one of them, which is the Inflation Reduction Act. This is literally hot off the press. Right now, the U.S. Treasury Department is reviewing the legislation to see what that means from a tax perspective. But in a nutshell, a key part of what this involves are private sector tax credits, to where you can get, if you are a private company, up to a 30% investment tax credit. And then you can get bonus percentages of tax credits depending on other factors, like if you can have domestic content bonus, or if you develop this in areas that have either had brownfield issues or significant investment in petroleum efforts in the past. And there's also an extension of the alternative fuel tax credit. Now, if you're a municipality, you may say, well, hey, can we go out and just do this on our own? And is there any financial provision for that? So the legislation does allow for what's called a direct pay provision. But our understanding, and again, this is going to be subject to what the Treasury Department ultimately decides, but if you run the numbers, there's generally going to be a better financial amount of dollars if you go with the private sector tax credits rather than the direct pay provision, which would then mean from a public sector perspective that you would then need to consider a public-private partnership. And then that creates a whole additional level of financial analysis, because you're going to need to share those expenses and revenue with the private sector. This next slide is information that, again, is in the North Central Texas Council of Governments guide that I'll show you all in just a moment. So if you want to think about what a P3 could look like in terms of sharing the risk and rewards between the public and private sector. That information is in that guide. And so the last slide I wanted to communicate is again, this reference guide. This was a project that we just completed for the North Central Texas Council of Governments. It was funded via a US EPA grant as a part of US EPA's efforts to really increase potential projects on this topic of food waste to anaerobic digestion to RNG. So key information that's included in this study are a material supply and fuel demand analysis. So if you want to get a sense of what are the types of trucks that might be in your region that could utilize this type of fuel, that's all evaluated. It's not just refuse vehicles, but also buses and 18-wheelers as well. We also evaluated different types of collection networks. If you want to get a sense of what our thoughts are in terms of cost per collection or cost per ton, comparing different collection options, that's evaluated there, as well as information about the case studies for both Dallas and Denton, as well as the contract guide information, as well as funding information, as I talked about on the prior slide. So with that, we'll be happy to answer any questions that you may have.
Thank you, Scott.
I just want to remind the folks on Zoom, if you have any questions, use the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen to type in your question. We will ask as many of them as we can. And we do have a microphone. We'll be going around the room. If you have any questions, please raise your hand. And first, I want to thank you, Michael, for the live demonstration. I've been to many conferences, never seen it in action. So thank you. And I would like to kick it off with one question is we had yesterday actually from the city of Beverly Hills. What kind of behavior change will this require from our residents to make this work?
You know, I think it really starts with helping people to understand comfortability with using the disposer. I think generally people are reluctant to use their disposer as much as they could. And it's because they have at one time experienced a problem or they've heard somebody talk about a problem. So I think it really starts with good education and outreach on proper use and help dispelling the myths about water use, electricity use, clogged plumbing.
Kevin, you have anything you want to add to this?
You could just repeat everything he said for municipal utilities. A lot of times utility operators, like I said earlier, does not want to have additional biosolids that they're treating. They don't want their pipes to be clogged by this material. So it's just an education component that you need to work with the engineers in the group.
Thank you. Any questions from the audience?
So one question for the last presenter about environmental justice. So I work for the city of Glendale. We have a landfill. We're trying to, see what we want to do with our gas, and this RNG concept keeps coming up. How do you, when you talk about environmental justice, how do you know where the gas is going to be burned? Because whether or not the gas is burned at the landfill, if you clean up the RNG, you put it in a pipeline, and it may be burned in some communities where there is a huge environmental issues already. So I'm just kind of curious how you're able to make that nexus that it's beneficial.
Yeah, thank you for asking that question. And I can give you the perspective from how we evaluated that for both the city of Dallas and the city of Denton. Each of those communities owns and operates their own landfills, maybe similar to Glendale as you described. And you can look at the analysis that's in the report for more detail. But we followed guidance from the US EPA on environmental justice. But in a nutshell, and so we actually evaluated the status quo in terms of the emissions impacts from various types of air quality issues based on the status quo, and then compared that to what would it look like if you would put in the type of system that we were describing. And so there's at least two primary benefits from a emissions perspective. The first is going to be at the landfill. So even if you have a landfill gas collection system, which is the case for both Dallas and Denton, being able to divert that material into anaerobic digestion is just going to be more efficient. So you're going to have fewer emissions from that perspective. And so in the case of the landfill, you can state that, this landfill, if you're able to do this from a food waste perspective, is going to have reduction in emissions. And then the second component is, and this was an assumption that we made as a part of our project, is that these RNG vehicles would be replacing diesel trucks within the region. And so then you go from the carbon intensity perspective, where RNG is the least impactful, then comparing that against, say, diesel generating trucks. And then those trucks are operating in those areas where there are environmental justice issues. Does that help? Okay.
Hi, a question for incinerator and the second speaker. I noticed that there was a slurry mechanism or something that happened between collecting it from the generators and then putting it into the wastewater treatment plant. Can we get
Yeah.
more understanding of that, how that happens?
So I focused on the residential disposers, but Scott had a picture in his slide deck of grind to energy, and then Kevin talked about it. About 8 or 10 years ago, InSinkErator developed grind to energy. It is a non-sewer based system where you use a 10 horsepower grinder, very little water, and you use a peristaltic hose pump to put that slurry into a tank on site. So this is typically installed at grocery stores, sporting venues, like we have one at the New England Patriots, the Cleveland Browns Stadium, number of universities, Notre Dame, University of Illinois. Anyway, the food waste slurry is then held in a tank, say for a week or two, maybe even 3 weeks. But because it's a low pH, it's beginning the hydrolysis, acidification. It actually is low pH. It does not degrade very much. It's pickled, if you will. It's breaking down into acetic acid or vinegar. Then that slurry is delivered directly to the anaerobic digesters via a truck, a vacuum pumper. And that slurry is used to create methane gas and the fertilizer. So it's a system that we have, several across the US, mainly in Southern California, Massachusetts, Southeast Wisconsin. It is a very new developing technology.
We actually have a couple of questions that came in from our Zoom participants, and there are a couple that relate to our conversation yesterday regarding PFAS. One of them is, given yesterday's conversation about PFAS and concentration of the chemicals in wastewater, how will we be able to recover those biosolids / nutrients for land application safely?
So that's a tricky one. I just participated in a webinar while I listened in from the Water Research Foundation last week. Number of researchers looking at this. The amount of PFAS in biosolids, from my perspective as a 30-year wastewater professional, are small. If we're really truly concerned about PFAS, we need to be worried about our food packaging and the products that we're putting on our clothes, the fire retardants, as people has talked about. It's kind of the same argument for years that we did with toxics and heavy metals with sludges. These are at very small levels in our biosolids. I think we haven't done a true good risk assessment to understand the long-term health risks. But when you're talking about putting this on soils, it's a very small amount what ends up on as a land applied material.
It's interesting because one of the follow-up questions, Michael, was, I'm not going to read the whole question, but the last sentence was, curious if there are net benefits when the useful end product is out of the equation. And I think, if I'm hearing your answer correctly, that last part, the useful end product is out of the equation, isn't an automatic. Am I hearing that right?
Well, many cities do not land apply for cost reasons. It's just simply less expensive to put it in a landfill, right? You've got quite a bit of capital involved in your mill organite process, but that's the way you've chosen to manage your biosolids.
Yeah, and because we sell Milorganite in 49 of the 50 states, we have to meet all the state requirements because EPA has not come out with a requirement for PFAS or PFOA yet. So we have 49 different requirements that we have to make sure that we comply with, and we comply with all of those state organizations, whether it's Michigan, Massachusetts, Maine, they're all very strict. So we're watching that because it's a commercial product for us.
Yeah, and this was also a key part of our evaluation process for that project for the North Central Texas Council of Governments. And one of the reasons why City of Dallas facility was identified as a potential pilot project is that they have a very significant amount of available capacity on site at their for the management of the sludge. And so the more that you can process and in a controlled environment so that it doesn't have to be considered for land application or going offsite into a landfill, that's also a part of what you should be thinking about as a solid waste director.
Thank you, Colonel Burnley, City of Beverly Hills. Great topic, great discussion. As it relates to the RNG and the use of RNG in the trucks, we've now been, the goal is to electrify trash trucks. So where will we use that RNG? I know there's other avenues that we could use the
Right.
RNG, but I think we have, it'll be conflict in our what's the word? Competing, you got competing factors. So you got manufacturers that gotta create electric trucks now. And then what happens to those developers and those investments
Right.
that are put towards RNG?
Right. Yeah, no, it's a very good question. And so there's so much interest in electrification, like you said. But my understanding, and Birds of Mac does a lot of work on the utility side in terms of transmission, distribution, and power generation, that, you know, if every vehicle or truck that wanted to electrify would be able to do that, we just don't have the power capacity to make that happen in the near future. And as part of that project that I referred to for the North Central Texas Council of Governments, we evaluated how many of the different types of trucks between refuse, delivery vehicles, and other types of trucks and transit buses, how many of those are currently utilizing RNG? And then what's the additional potential demand for that? And it's such a small fraction that are presently utilizing the alternative vehicles that there's just so much more room to grow, that the demand should be there in the future.
Just a question about the digesters in general. Older homes that have an older model, is there any limitations with that? Or is it InSinkErator like a kicked up version?
Yeah, great question. A lot of precautions, or people are worried that they're going to clog their plumbing or their sewer lateral or the sewers. The first thing I would say is if you have problems with your plumbing transporting food waste, you're probably going to have trouble transporting sewage solids. Number one, food waste is 75 to 90% water. It's the same density as water. The particles are 2 to 3 millimeters in size. And so again, if you're using it properly, you shouldn't have issues. And unfortunately, there are many communities with older cast iron pipes that over time, they occlude, they develop corrosion. Very different with PVC, right? You don't have that buildup of the corrosion. So there may be instances where it's not the best,
Okay.
right? But I would argue you're probably going to have a problem transporting your wastewater as well at some point.
Just a follow-up. So did I hear you say eggshells should not be put in there? And is there anything else that shouldn't be? And I'm going to look up your study on fat, soil, and grease, but if you can summarize that, because I know our
Sure.
wastewater treatment plant educates to not do that.
Eggshells are fine. Anything is fine in small quantities. You don't want to put a lot of any one type of food waste, but then again, you don't want to waste food waste anyway. So if you have a lot of any one type of food waste, that's a bad thing to begin with. So a couple of eggshells, or when you're having breakfast, making an omelet, not a big deal. Putting a 5-gallon bucket of eggshells is bad. With regard to fats, oils, and grease, the city of Raleigh, North Carolina banned disposers in 2008. It was right after I came on board to InSinkErator. The public works director said, this is the reason we need to ban disposers. And he held up a mason jar of fog deposits from sewers. We eventually worked with Kevin Keener at Purdue University, who had just worked at WRF to do a study on those deposits. And he said, look, I just spent 3 years studying these. There's no food waste in it. Eventually, we worked with Purdue, NC State, and Battelle and developed what we see as the mechanism of how these deposits form in sewers to help the wastewater industry. Triglycerides, or fats, oils, and grease, break down, especially in grease interceptors, into free fatty acids. And then they react with calcium, which comes from concrete, hardness, dairy products. Am I forgetting something, Casey? Yeah, and potentially dairy products. And then it forms calcium palmitate, which is insoluble. These deposits are forming in sewers all around the world, including cities where there are no disposers. So it is a phenomena that municipalities have a challenge. They've got to deal with it. So we are trying to do a better job of educating consumers. Don't pour your fats, oils, and grease down your disposer, and don't pour it down your sink or your toilet either, right? Because it ends up in the same place. And unfortunately, people don't really know much about where their wastewater goes, and they don't really care much about their trash pickup, either one, unless they have a sewage backup in their basement or the trash doesn't get picked up. So.
Have you talked to the Water Environment Federation? Is there some interest of laying out some policy on this? Because I've crossed over where you'll talk with wastewater directors that have these type facilities, and they're very protective of them. And they're like, I don't want anything coming in. So how do you combat that?
Well, number one, we get involved in organizations like this where we share the research. I've presented a number of times at WEF, and we engage with the leaders at WEF, like Barry Liner and Maria Lano from the biosolids person. And we try and make sure that we make all of this research available so that people actually, we're trying to be transparent. We're not hiding anything, and we're trying to be honest.
And we're a conservative approach. We take a conservative approach to our facilities. So we're always going to probably be less inclined to do something new until we really can prove it out. So we rely on WERF and WEF and those folks to help us with that.
Also why it's good to take them out to lunch.
I love lunch. Yeah.
It works.
From a climate change perspective, we know that we have to go beyond just reducing emissions, is that we have to remove CO2 from the atmosphere. The city of Santa Fe is just embarking on a new project with some other public entities to do an RFP and evaluate proposals for removal and permanent storage of CO2. So Scott, I noticed on one of your slides where you kind of showed that process, you included CO2 removal. And I wondered, do you know if this process would be considered a drawdown project? And did you look at, or could you conceivably look at using that CO2 removal and then having some other way to permanently store it so that it is a drawdown project?
Well, I don't know if this will answer your question exactly, Shirlene, but I know that there are projects that are looking at the viability of the sequestration of that type of material. I think there's a lot of different ideas that are out there, and what will come to be the proven solution or technology, I think, is still to be determined, and perhaps your RFP process might shed some good light on that.
My question is for Kevin. I do both solid waste and wastewater. So how much was the receiving station, and is that more of a septic receiver that you converted, or is it a dual purpose station, or strictly for the food waste? And does it process all the food waste that you receive?
So the receiving station was built just for the food waste, and I think the cost was around 1.8 million-ish. If I can get you a better number on that, but I think it was in that range. So it was just built for the food waste that we're taking through the truck deliveries.
There's no pre-processing. It's more of flow equalization, so they can feed the material slower into the digester. And you've been taking de-icing fluid from the airport for years as well.
Since the 70s. Yeah, we've been taking de-icing fluid since the 1970s, which is a really nice way to perk the bugs up in your digester, so you can produce more gas from it. Oh, okay. Everyone's different, right?
Okay, unfortunately, this is the last question we could take. I want to thank Michael, Kevin, and Scott for being here today, and we'll give them a round of applause. We're gonna take a couple seconds to set up for our next speakers. We're gonna be plowing through this through lunch, and I'll ask the Samaha group to come up stage.